I'm Judy Murray. Behind every champion is a driving force.
Welcome to Immersive Sports Science. Sports science, not bro science. Content, hopefully devoid of commentary.
Now guys, if you just want to skip to the sports science information, go to this time point here. If you want to skip the synopsis, the short version of this review, go to this time point on my right.
I scored these interviews a 91.17, and here's why.
Driving Force with Judy Murray is advertised as a docu-series, but in reality it's more like a profile and a series of interviews detailing what motivates and drives female athletes. It is split over 10 episodes, including the likes of Rebecca Eglinton, Katie Taylor, Christina Horrigu, and Judy Murray herself. There is also a YouTube series as well, which expands upon everything stated pretty much within those profiles and expands upon it and looks at other areas of women's sport and other people within women's sport, not just those interviewed, as well as other topics not necessarily mentioned within those interviews. Now, as I go through this, many of you might think I'm even virtue signalling or might not like how I'm detailing the other side. I'm going to be impartial and in balance as best I can, and will explain when it's my own opinion and try and explain the science. This is the whole point of these deep dive reviews. I explain the science in detail. In Immersive Sports Science, we go deep on the science. Now, there was a lot of points raised within the documentary series and their YouTube content, more so than what we can actually speak here. So I'm going to choose to speak on the most talked about parts within these documentaries and YouTube series. When it comes to female sport, we generally don't tend to have that many coaches that are female. Yes, there are exceptions to the rules. And we generally don't tend to have women training men as well that often. Yes, yet again, there are exceptions to the rule. Wade Van Niekerk's coach, the 400-meter men's world record holder.
Before I started working with Emily, I was chatting to Darren Cahill, who's one of the top Australian kind of coaches. He's worked with Agassi and many others. I was talking to him about, potential coaches that could work with me. He said to me, what about some of the top sort of ex-female players? To me, it was a bit of a no-brainer. And then it wasn't until I started working with Emily when I started to see the other reasons probably why there's not as many female coaches.
You realised quite quickly if you didn't do as well or better than you had done, that she was really going to get it in the neck.
Before the French Open started that year, I got asked in a press conference, who my next coach might be, and Martina Navratilova's name was put out there as a possibility. And that was then in the press, that I was considering working with a female coach, and I started getting messages from other players, from their coaches saying, I can't believe you're playing this game with the media, you should tell them tomorrow you're considering working with a dog. I never had experienced that before because I'd never worked with a female coach on the tour. When I lost matches previously in my career, nobody questioned my coach. It's always, in tennis, generally is the individual that gets questioned, and that wasn't the case when I was working with Emily, and it's kind of like one of my regrets. I didn't win a Grand Slam when I was working with her. For a lot of people, that was considered a failure. I feel like she was harshly judged by a lot of people just purely because she was a woman.
Now, a woman shouldn't be judged from a coaching perspective on whether she has to be better than the men in order to be the same as the men. That is an utterly pointless, fallacious argument. It should be judged on whether they're actually good as a coach, and if they haven't done well as a coach, it's because either A, they haven't related well with the athlete, maybe they're not the best coach for that athlete, or the fact that they are just a crap coach, not because they are a woman. Trust me, there are many male coaches who are crap coaches also.
Because from a brand perspective, it's a missed commercial opportunity. There is a perception that female sports are only watched by women, which is just so far from the truth. If you think about sports fans, 84% of sports fans watch female sports. And if you're really specific and you think about female football, only 36% of female football fans are women. So you've got the audience there. So it's such a missed commercial opportunity. And you see so many brands get behind male sports and they sort of get behind potential. And where it comes to female sport, you have to be proven. You have to have already delivered. You have to have already won championships, normally before brands get involved. And if you think about where female sports are absolutely resonating in terms of the audience, it tends to be with Generation X, it tends to be with Generation Z, and those audiences are audiences that want to see brands that reflect their own beliefs and their own purpose, and essentially they will pay and put their money where their mouth is when they see brands invest and absolutely resonate with their own purpose. And I genuinely don't understand why more brands aren't doing more, because we will celebrate all sorts of male sports heroes, and there's that absolute opportunity to do the same in terms of female sportswomen and how much they deliver, and the perfection and the drive and the focus and the delivery.
I think every brand, if a brand can represent a man, they can represent a woman. I mean, this is from my personal experience. There's a lot of brands out there a lot of talk at the moment about representing everybody, and who haven't put their money where their mouth is yet. It will probably be like a cascade effect. I think if some big brands really step up and say, look, we are going to champion women's sport in the way it deserves, in the way that we've championed men in sport for so long, that other brands will follow.
Voice away. I thought I was going to say that I think we make up 51% of the population, but like I wouldn't like to guess the numbers of us represented or sponsored or anything else. So, you know, there's a big difference in what we actually are in the population and how we're presented to it.
Visibility is really important, and look, it's increasing for sure, and there are a number of organisations and newspapers which are absolutely covering more female sports, but it's still only about 4% of female sports are actually covered, and that has a cyclical effect, because unless you can see brilliant women performing at their best and delivering and winning and achieving, that has an effect on more women getting into the sport and believing that they can do it. So we don't normalise it. And that's what we've got to get to. We've got to get to normalising seeing brilliant women perform just as well as we see brilliant men perform.
Now, when it comes to basic economics, if you suppress someone so much, it's going to take them time to build that sport up, take time to build women's sport, to be on the same level in terms of the skill used as the men. Now, as the skill is the same level, people will go and watch. And people will watch these sports generally, as we've shown by the Women's World Cup. If you build it, according to Leanne Norman, they will come. Now, there are certain sports like athletics, where the women and the men share a certain amount of equality. And there's even certain sports like tennis, where the women get paid more per ball than the men, because they get equal amount of pay. And certain suggestions that maybe they're more equal than the men. Debatable, but yeah. In the fact that what people will focus on is what makes them money. And if women's sports makes money, they will focus on it. If it doesn't, they won't. When it comes to professional sports, it's all about hard economics. We can't ignore the fact that certain people will try and argue moral factors as to why potentially women aren't earning the same amount. And that kind of affected when we saw the boxing. When we saw the boxing board of the control, when we saw about how Jane couldn't defend her world title because some stupid law that women weren't allowed to box in the UK. We kind of seen this as well with the Scottish Commonwealth Games when we look at the documentaries around Kirsten Fraser.
And when it came to it, they sent a full team of men, no women. It was probably the biggest slap in the face I've ever experienced. They had no real justification, no real cause. I think at one point they said, we can't send any women because they'll get hurt. Point in trying to go by, people in a governing body where there's some people will openly say, I don't think women should box. Why on earth should I get my arse out of bed in the morning and go train and fight international for a country who doesn't think I should be in the ring? As
a coach, there are many different things they don't particularly teach you. You kind of have to learn while you're out there in the environment. And likewise, training females to training males is going to be slightly different, just like training children to training adults. The type of training programs may be similar physiologically, the principles are the same, but technically they're not.
Between a male and a female boxer, probably the biggest difference is the mood swings every month. Once a month you came for a whole week of training, you're going to be dealing with somebody that's on the edge.
I was allowed to go onto the personal training floor, into the gym. I was allowed to work with dozens of females, and no one ever told me this, and I was left to find it out myself. The physiological differences between genders when it comes to fat loss are too big to be overlooked by coaches, trainers, or women aspiring to better their physique and performance. However, it will take approximately 33% longer for a female to burn the same amount of calories. Cool. There are many more factors at play outside simply eating less and moving more when it comes to sustainable fat loss, especially in women. Here we have the menstrual cycle. I've not had one, certainly not yet, but I'm going to be talking you through it today. Average menstrual cycle is 28 days long. In the middle, we have ovulation. The first part of the cycle is known as the follicular phase. The latter part is known as the luteal phase. And I'm probably doing the menstrual cycle a disservice if I was to say there's a good side and a bad side. The follicular phase is the good side. The luteal phase is more the bad side. In the middle, ovulation, just before, women have a spike in testosterone. It's where their best gym performances typically occur. And, to be crass, it's where they typically get the horniest, and it's because they are the most fertile part of the menstrual cycle. So lads in the room, take note. After menstruation, hit ovulation. After ovulation, we start to move towards the end of the cycle. Towards the end of the cycle, in the latter days, some women suffer with PMS. Now, putting that out there, oversimplifying it, that's fine. But there are considerations that we have to make whilst doing this. Measurements and metrics. If we were to say that you have a 4-week cycle, too many females are measuring themselves week on week, which means they are measuring different physiologies. This means that between week 1 and week 2, between week 2 and week 3, between week 3 and week 4, 4 separate sets of measurements, 4 separate sets of circumferences, no consideration to different physiologies across those. If you are going to make measurements, you must do it in line with your menstrual cycle. Week 1, week 1. Week 2, week 2. Week 3, week 3. Because changes outside of your control with your physiology can have a massive impact on fluctuations in weight and circumference. You are measuring changes in your physiology and you are beating yourself up about them.
So I grew up with the ideal that women could do what they wanted to do as long as they had the drive for it. We had the same recovery and the same training schedule as the men. And it really kind of started really getting under my skin a bit, going, what's going on? And at the same time, I was in the undergraduate kinesiology program, studying exercise physiology, nutrition, and part of the requirement was to actually be a participant in the labs. For example, this is one that I really remember. It sticks out well. It was me and 2 guys, and we had to run on a treadmill for 2 hours one week, and then the next week do the exact same thing. The first time I did it, I ran, and it was awesome. 2 hours, no issues whatsoever. No water, just people going, I can't believe you're running for 2 hours on the treadmill. The following week, first half an hour was okay, but the last hour and a half felt like 5 years. I was like, what is going on? And we started looking at the results, and it was really interesting to see my results showing that in the first trial, I was using a lot of fat as fuel, which is great because you have an opportunity to go for a long time. But the second trial, I burned through a lot of carbohydrate, and then I was having a really difficult time to fuel myself. And I thought that was interesting, but what was even more interesting is that there was no difference for the guys at all.
And this is where having female coaches will help. But we don't just need them to coach women, we need them to coach men, because generally having more coaches in general is needed. There is not enough female coaches within sport. They don't necessarily represent what is in sport. For instance, there are hardly many athletic female coaches. Yet again, females make up probably 50% of an athletics team.
I think what Andy Murray did by hiring a woman as a coach is also a new door open. That's how to encourage them. Women have to believe also they can be great coaches because there are other women that show it. And I think it's a big part of it. A lot of them think it's a men's world. I don't have my place there. It's not a place for a woman. It is. It is also a place for women, and we have to show that.
Look at the person. Don't just think, oh, they're a girl or they're a boy. Just look at the person, think about what that person has and the potential they have and where they can go. But we need more women in every single position because girls need to see them. To see it is to be it.
Becky, I think you need a sports psychologist. And I was like, why? What's wrong with me?
When it comes to mental health, there was at a time a real stigma surrounding it, and that's slowly being worn away. When people used to go towards a sports psychologist or someone told them to look for a sports psychologist, they'd often answer, why, what's wrong with me? I only need to go to a psychologist if it needs fixing. I don't feel like I need fixing. I'm not mentally unwell. And that's one of the big misconceptions with sports psychology. Often when we work with the DCEP Northern Applied Hub, part of the British Psychological Society, we've often detailed in our own podcasts that the fixing element, if we can fix someone, unlikely, is only really a third of what a sports psychologist does. The most part of what a sports psychologist does is actually trying to find ways to mentally improve performance. During the 90s and the early noughties, we were trying to raise awareness of what sports psychology and what psychology actually is, psychology being the understanding of human behaviour, and trying to explain its worth within a team, and trying to explain to those teams and individuals and sporting governing bodies it was worth to invest in psychology because it will help improve your athlete's performance. BASIS includes 3 main areas or domains of sports science which are important. Sports psychology is one of those domains, and every other kind of domain of sports science fits into one of those, or one of 3 of those areas, or all 3 of those areas. Yet, for some reason, sports psychology is not necessarily seen on the same platform or the same level as things like sports physiology or biomechanics and kinesiology, or even some of the smaller domains like nutrition. There are 2 main reasons probably for this. Firstly, sports psychology is not very much a hard science, it's very much a qualitative science. And in the professional stats-based driven world we are in, it's harder to prove its worth compared to something like sports physiology, biomechanics, which are heavily fact-based is the wrong word, but numbers-based field where you can physically see changes in performance. It's a bit harder to show a mental improvement in performance. You have to kind of verify it onto other things. And there could be other factors that impact or are the reasons why the athlete's performing, not just because they got a mental look on life that's slightly different than what they had before, or they're behaviourally thinking in a different way, or their behaviour's changed in a certain way. The second reason is probably more down to inner fighting or inner ideas of what sports psychology actually is. It doesn't matter from the point of view of the people who've actually been employing the sports psychologist, whether they've got an actual proper understanding of sports psychology or whether they've got this pop understanding of sports psychology. The worth of sports psychology is actually improved. The understanding is improved even if it is just a pop psychology understanding of it. What is the problem is understanding the actual physical monetary worth of the sports psychologist and understanding that they are focused heavily upon care of the athletes, not necessarily focusing heavily upon the performance of the athlete, and with that care aspect potentially being worth more than the performance side, the treatment of the sports psychologist and the money amount being paid to them affects whether they can live, affects whether people want to actually partake within that profession. If my profession's not seen as being that important relatively to others, they're going to charge me less. If I decide, this is from a capitalist point of view, that if I'm all about care and not necessarily worth about money, the businessmen are going to likely pay me less, and I'm less likely to seek pay rises. Because it's not about me, it's about the athlete, and quite rightly so. But also quite not rightly so, because how can I help anyone if I can't support myself? Now, the slight problem with that second understanding is that sports scientists as a whole often get paid less anyway. So when we enter the professional landscape, so it's not that really good at that an argument. Sports psychology has a high ethical practices, and quite rightly so. The reasons why we think it's care first is because we've had a long history of quacks and people trying to ship in to get money at the expense of their customers and clients. Many arguments outside of the field of sports psychology that wouldn't even bat an eyelid. For instance, certain instances like, can we earn money ethically while we're not sports psychology? What we keep within the domains of sports psychology is often kind of frowned upon. Or in fact, just mentioning the word money is just kind of frowned upon. Another thing that sports psychology often gets mixed up in is the idea of mental health. A sports psychologist will not help you with their mental health, they help you with your performance. A general psychologist, or a psychologist specialising in mental health, or a psychiatrist even, would be able to help you with your mental health. A sports psychologist will not help you with their mental health, they help you with your performance. A general psychologist, or a psychologist specialising in mental health, or a psychiatrist even, would be able to help you with your mental health.
So in 2003, I was actually getting ready for World Championships in Paris, and I got another niggle in my calf, and I think having that niggle again just deflated everything about me, thinking, not again. Having another injury almost just like crushed me, and I ended up having a massive breakdown. I went into the toilets and I just broke down. I looked in the mirror and I literally hated everything about myself because my body was always letting me down. I just tried so hard to keep it going. I ended up looking in the mirror, hating myself. I saw the scissors on the side and ended up cutting myself for every day I'd been injured, and that had been quite a few days. Now, as a female, you're wearing a crop top and you're wearing shorts, so you end up thinking amongst the black cloud and mist and wanting to jump into a hole and not see tomorrow, which is exactly what I felt. In one head, I'm still getting ready for World Champs and I've got to go out in public, so I was putting makeup over scars. And you know, mental health is a thing that you're never ever, you don't think about that. It just impacts your life like nothing. You know, and I was at the depths of despair, but I didn't know who to talk to. On one side of me, I was dying, and the other side, I was living for my dream to be Olympic champion. And I went to those World Championships and I got a silver medal, and no one knew what was happening.
So you were holding all of this to yourself, and by harming yourself, were you in some way trying to hurt your body for letting you down again?
You take that personally to yourself, and I think it was just a massive outlet of crying without being able to cry to someone, to look weak. I didn't want anyone to know. I didn't want my opposition to know I was weak. And back then in 2003, you didn't talk about mental health. I didn't know about a breakdown, becoming a self-harmer, to being depressed. Had no idea what that meant. Didn't even know the label when I was going through it until after.
And it's become big now in the 2010s onwards to focus, or at least have an understanding that athletes have problems with their mental health due to the high performance nature of their environment and the stress that provides, that you have to perform, especially when it's part of your identity. Now, we put a lot of focus upon athletes, but we tend to forget the coaches and the support staff who are also under the same amount of pressure and not necessarily with the same amount of support. Take a football manager. They've only really got about 6 games because that's how much the research dictates, when the likelihood in the Premier League, you're likely to be positioned by the end of the year, unless you have a year like this year. You've only got around about 6 games, including your warm-up games, to prove that you are the manager, to the end of the year. Otherwise, you've got the sack. Now, you may be asking, why should I care? They got a lot of money. Yes, but people don't think like that in the moment.
Sport. One is you get mental illness, which we'll get the depressions, obsessional compulsive disorders. But the second thing is I've recognised that the girls try and cope with this, but it becomes a very dysfunctional coping strategy. So we get a lot of self-harm with cutting, starving themselves, or even overeating. And it's dysfunctional coping strategies which present them with their own problems. And that just escalates this feeling that this young person is out of control. And unfortunately, I have met in elite sport a lot of condemnation of this instead of empathy and understanding and actually helping them. Mental health has always had a stigma, and we're fighting so hard to get over this, to say, you know, when depression hits people, it can come out the blue, but it's often to dealing with stress, and it's nothing to do with the person's inability, it's to do with the fact that they've got stresses which none of us can cope with.
Now, there's a heavy focus on trying to develop mental toughness and mental resilience in athletes, especially from a young age. And that is important, but what is mental toughness and resilience? Can you define it? Can a sports psychologist define it? Can I define it? Overcoming adversity, rebounding and bouncing back in positive psychology and mental toughness, all these phrases could now come under the umbrella of resilience. Well, debatable, possibly. The well-being guys probably wouldn't think that, but we'll let them think whatever they want to think. And this is what we mean. We don't quite know what mental toughness and resilience are. Yes, we have definitions, but we don't really quite know what they are in psychology. Resilience has been defined as a protective mechanism thought to emerge from a specific personality trait or even from a state situation. What we mean by state situation is how society or the social surroundings impact us. And as a result, we come up with adaptive or coping strategies. In essence, resilient individuals come up with processes that help them deal with situations or scenarios. And this can be innate with them, or these could be things they potentially learn. As a result of their experiences or what they've been taught, they become potentially mentally stronger. And as a result, they end up building upon their confidence and self-esteem, as well as their determination and other potential internal factors as recognised by Albert Bandura. Now, Albert Bandura was a really cool bloke who invented social learning theory, which basically means we are affected by the society around us. If you like, they build up a repertoire. Now, a repertoire of psychological skills, or we in the sports psychology domain and world called this our psychological toolbox. And this makes us more flexible and adapted to the situation. Yeah, sometimes we sit there and we can't cope with the situation, even though we've experienced a situation before. And sometimes we can adapt. As a result, we can then choose what is the best tool for that particular situation because we already have it within our toolbox in order to help us overcome adversity. This will install a resilient nature within that individual.
We still have people when they call me in saying, can you help with this young woman? And they say she needs help because she's got a poor self-image or she can't deal with setbacks, and this is seen as a weakness. You know, and the kind of thing I get told is, you need to get mentally tough. And I keep trying to explain it's nothing to do with mental toughness. It's to do with the fact that we have inbuilt systems in our head that we have to learn how they operate and how to manage them.
The main coach was Lloyd, and I was just there to help with the speed and also to be a female presence, because I think sometimes when you're in athletics, people don't understand that there is a human side to the person, and there's a side that you need to understand.
Men don't have that thing with women to women, like the kind of talks, the personal talks. Most probably look at us as a father figure, and that's what we are. We are father figures amongst the athletes then.
For my career, I didn't have that. So I didn't have a female presence. So I felt that it was important that I stay in the sport and actually have a voice and actually encourage women.
And of course, the main aim of Judy Murray's docu-series was to look at what drives and what motivates an athlete. And that is going to be individual to the athlete. Yet again, there may be some similarities between different athletes and certainly between sports that are similar. Everyone is an individual, and therefore that will impact what works best for them when it comes to motivation. What becomes what drives them to win. It might be something extrinsic, like winning an Olympic medal, or could be something intrinsic, something inside, something that feels good. It could be the both, best of both. We know that intrinsic motivation is a lot better than extrinsic, but yet again, a lot of athletes are extrinsically motivated. Therefore, there's something about extrinsic motivation competition that makes them a better athlete. It is believed that intrinsic motivation, although acts as enables you to reflect on your performance, reflect how it is, and also allows you, if case of loss, to be able to not take that loss so personally, so you can bounce back. Yet again, it does potentially, or might do, damper competition, damper your competitiveness. Although we don't quite know why, athletes are incredibly extrinsically motivated. In science, gender refers to a sociological constructed difference between women and men, while the term sex is a reference to a biological and physical differences between males and females. However, in everyday life, they're used interchangeably. Modern sport appears to have a historically variable relative autonomy, This is to say, what happens in sport can be explained by looking at the changing balances of power between the groups involved in sports and what's happening in the wider environment. The integration in sports in wider social figurations such as national societies often impacts one's views about women and men partaking in sport and how that impacts societies, and also vice versa. Historically, society expected or expects males and females to adopt, believe in and fulfill specific gender roles and stereotypes that have been well established from a very young age. In the Western world, males are expected to be strong, independent and athletic, protectors and breadwinners, whereas females are expected to be quiet, obedient and potentially attractive nurturers. Views positively and negatively affect our likelihood of choices for work, choices for job, how we behave, our personalities, as well as the exercise and sport we are likely to do in a later life. Some of these stereotypes and schemas or stigmas are subtle but can have a potential impact. At the same time, we can't ignore how puberty affects one's mind as we develop as well, and ultimately affects the personality and potentially affects the way we see sport. To what degree this all impacts us in terms of our personality, our choice of sport and exercise is quite frankly unclear. Of course, this can lead to gender-specific ideas of what is beauty, what is exercise, and what is sport willing to do. For instance, in the 21st century, we have a massive impact upon Instagrammers doing booty building, and that has had an impact on people or women wanting to learn how to do weights. Whereas in the 20th century, it was more about being cardio bunnies and not wanting to look butch, not wanting to build muscle. Of course, there are more niche areas of beauty that have come into play, how people want to look and how exercise, or even not exercising in this case, can lead you to get that particular look and the pressures surrounding that particular look.
LMAO, you ever just want to punch this chick in the face is what this emoji is. Chilly, I go cry now. This audio wasn't meant for you, love. You knew what you were doing, like, well, I didn't think I was gonna get my feelings hurt like this today. On your face, it was rough. And then her comment section is filled with essentially all positivity.
Bullying in sports can strip athletes of their individuality, making them more sport focused or making them scared of actually partaking in that sport. You find with athletes who are very good, they're often heavily focused, heavily determined upon their sport, which can have an impact upon other areas of their life. Nonetheless, also, the chance of you becoming an elite athlete and the chance of you becoming a winning elite athlete is very slim. It's often around about 2%.
I got a lot of comments being like, oh, you're a bit big to be a sports person, aren't you? I think the perception is that you are stick thin as a sports person, as an athlete. Everyone is just super thin with a six-pack. And I'm like, it's not always the case. I don't think I've ever had a six-pack in my life.
I certainly haven't.
I've trained like 30 hours a week and I've still not got a six-pack. I don't think it's physically possible for me to ever have a six-pack, but it's just everyone's body shape is different, and I think you don't always fit the mold of what a traditional person of that sport is, and I certainly never fit the mold. For me, the online bullying started once I'd had success until after Beijing, and then just got hammered on the trolling, and just, it was always about my appearance. It was always the way I looked.
I think for girls in particular, because society may have given them low self-esteem at the start, to then have these criticisms given to them while they're in the limelight can be really soul-destroying. So yes, I have dealt with a lot of female athletes who read these comments and it just demoralises them completely.
So when I first came home from the games in '92, my school said to me, what you need to do is come in with your medals. Once you've done Blue Peter, come back to school. We'll draw a line under it. We'll get on with your GCSEs. And I had a bit of a problem with my year group or my classmates who thought, because I wasn't talking about it, I thought I was too good to talk about it. But it's funny because if I'd have constantly been talking about how good it was at the games, and then I would have had equally as, I would have been called a big head anyway. So it was a bit tricky because I was this walking conversation stopper at school, and I remember I would be in the girls' toilet and I'd be in a cubicle and they'd come in and be talking about me. who does she think she is? You know, she comes to school with wet hair and, you know, she never talks about what she's doing and she's never available at weekends and she's always rushing off after school or she's gone running at lunchtime. And what would generally happen was in the morning, we'd all have our set desks within the form room to have registration, but they'd move themselves around so that I was kind of isolated, surrounded by the guys. And so then I would, you know, talk to them and then they were like, oh, look at you trying to get a boyfriend, or, you know, just like nitpicky stuff. But of course it was difficult because they wanted to go to the cinema, they were doing sleepovers, and I had this sort of parallel life in sport. So I told my parents about the challenges I was having, and we tried to be as pragmatic as we could, because you can't control somebody else's behaviour, and if they don't like you, they don't like you. You're not going to be able to change that a great deal. And because one of the sort of instigators of it was someone who'd been quite close to me, I knew her really well, but she didn't like where my career was going. It wasn't where her career was going. Maybe that was the jealousy side. So I would go to the library at break time to get work done. I would obviously go out at lunchtime. And then I'd leave school and I'd try and kind of avoid the situation where I was one-on-one with any of them, or not, you know, me against a few, as it were. And it was just a lonely existence at school. But I think because I had this other life where my swimming friends were and my swimming career was, and the aspirations I had there, it was worth it to suck it up, and because I knew my career in sport would last a lot longer than bullying at school. I think there was an element of not understanding, and also I'd grown up hugely at those games. I'd had 3 weeks in the Olympic Village with older people. I'd learnt the importance of, you know, that regiment of race day. Going through those processes as an athlete is completely different to being sat in a classroom and learning and rubbing shoulders and having to do interviews, having to think on your feet in front of a camera. And although it wasn't the same sort of coverage as we would enjoy now at the Paralympic Games, it was very much, you know, different to being a schoolgirl. It probably built a thicker skin on me that has helped in sport as well. If your competitors don't like you, or you come across a setup in coaching that, you know, you don't get on with, you need to be able to kind of like not react, retaliate all of the time. And so that emotional side of things, you have to be able to regulate. And I definitely learned to regulate the emotional side of it at school.
But did that at any point cause you any problems?
I used to take my own lunch, or I used to go and buy my lunch in the local village, because after a certain age, you were allowed to leave school at lunchtime and come back. But I'd stopped eating, really. I went out at lunchtime just for a walk. I didn't go and buy any food. I would have an apple or something, and I'd come back to school, and then I'd pick my way through my dinner after school. And I lost a lot of weight in that first term and a half at school. And it probably wasn't until the following February, when I went to the National Junior Swimming Championships, that one of the other parents who was looking after their son or daughter on poolside said to my dad, "Has Sarah been ill over Christmas?" I was painfully thin, and it wasn't a great situation because I didn't really want to eat during the day at school. I was kind of like eating by myself, but I didn't really feel hungry. It was just probably the only thing I could control during the day was the food intake. I couldn't control the behaviour of the other kids, so I could only control the eating. And it was probably another few weeks later that I wasn't gaining weight, I was still too skinny.
Two things I recognise happen in...
To put it simply, the production value, the content value, the production quality, and the content quality is all in this. It's high quality stuff. It wasn't too cinematic. It wasn't trying to be cinematic. A couple of times in the actual production itself, you see Judy Murray potentially riding a horse, which would be great for the YouTube channel and the other social media content, not particularly necessary for the actual docu interviews, but nonetheless, that's me just picking at straws, really. As well as the music itself, it's great, it accompanied the background, but at the same time, it probably was a little bit distracting. But other than that, for most music you can put in the background, most people say it's distracting, and that's probably what some people say about my videos as well. So personally, I didn't have a problem with it, but I can see people having a potential problem with it. For the most part, the interviews itself utilised a simple look and layout to them. And the way it was put together, quite frankly, it grabbed you on an emotional level. It grabbed you and it helped you to understand what drives an athlete to perform well at an elite level. The production added to the story of what the athlete was saying. The graphics used looked basic, frankly. It looked like a preset. it, to be honest, but it fitted and it worked well, regardless of it not being particularly professionally looking. However, on the other hand, when we look on the YouTube channel, we got something that's a little bit more advanced. Yes, still looks like a preset, but it still works with what was being said and works within the other forms of branding. Driving Force is a series of interviews and profiles of the best and greatest female athletes in Britain and over time in Britain, and is a 10-part series. Judy Murray offers an empathetic ear, but at the same time is not afraid to fling out difficult questions towards these girls. But her approach is soft, like, for instance, who installed your love for swimming? The chats were honest in parts, shot like a flashy American documentary like that of HBO, Tiger Wood or Being Serena Williams. The interviews were further enhanced with interviews by other interviewers of the most closest personnel who helped them on their way to greatness and success. The main aim of the documentary, or interview shall I say, was to discover what motivates that athlete. These set of interviews are not illicit exposés or confessions or reveals like some of Piers Morgan's interviews, for instance, but are more like deep dive into the understanding of the journey of an elite female athlete who has reached their pinnacle of the sport, how they got there, and the troubles they've had along the way and setbacks. Even though it's aimed for women, it's still relatable to all people who are watching, barring a couple of incidents. I personally found the interview with Christina Hurgu the most relatable, but then I'm biased in that respect because I too run 400s and I know Lloyd, her coach. Say is now my own opinion. Was this like some big, great, grand interview like the Oprah Lance Armstrong interviews? No. Is it going to appeal to a worldwide audience? Probably not. But for me, it hit deeply on a personal level. And it was highly relatable as a result. What these interviews do particularly well is they offer a solid psychological insight into what it takes to be the best and a potential glimpse into the elite athletic system, or elite sporting system of the UK, especially as a woman. Not just a glimpse to the life of the athlete, they offer something more pertinent, more relatable, more potentially surprising in some regards. The graphics and the editing was simplistic, but were well done and fitted well, even if they did have looked like I did it in a spare hour. I'm actually struggling to find any negatives with the series, other than it would have been lovely to have more facts go into the depth with the reviews. Don't just offer an insight, a sight into the athlete's life. They offer something more pertinent, more relatable, and for many potentially surprising. The graphics and the editing were simplistic but well done and fitted well, even if they did look like I did it in my spare hour. I'm actually struggling to find any negatives with this series, other than it would have been lovely to have some facts, maybe possibly narrated by Judy herself, with stats and figures, etc. But that defeats the point of this post-qualitative nature of these interviews, of a series like this, in which it's meant to be that here's the facts as they are, or at least how the athlete and those important people around them, experts so to speak, tell us, warts and all, and no glossing. Now make up your own mind. Up with the evidence we have provided.
I'm Judy Murray. Behind every champion is a driving force.
Give Sky Documentaries Judy Murray's Driving Force a KSA score of 91.17.
I say it's been an honour, and it's been my pleasure to guide you through your ups and downs. It's been more me grateful for having you as an athlete more than you having me as a coach, to give you the guidance to be a wonderful person that you are.